The hospital corridor was almost silent, the kind of silence that only exists just before dawn, when the night staff grows tired and the morning shift has not yet fully arrived. Fluorescent lights hummed softly above, casting a pale glow on the empty chairs and polished floors. At the far end of the hallway, a woman sat alone on a cold metal bench. One hand rested protectively on her pregnant belly, fingers moving slowly, almost unconsciously, as if to reassure the life growing inside her. In her other hand, she clutched a thin stack of hospital documents, test results, admission forms, consent papers, edges slightly bent from being held too tightly for too long. Her face showed exhaustion, but not drama. No tears streamed down her cheeks, no shaking shoulders. Just a quiet, heavy stillness, the kind that comes when the body is too tired to react and the heart hasn't yet caught up with what is happening. Nurses walked past her in quick practice steps, murmuring to one another, checking charts, answering buzzing phones. Somewhere behind a closed door, a monitor beeped steadily. A baby cried briefly, then fell silent. Life was moving all around her, but for this woman, time seemed to have slowed to a painful crawl. Every few minutes, her eyes lifted toward the end of the corridor, as if expecting someone to appear. Each time, disappointment settled in just a little deeper. Her phone lay face up beside her on the bench. The screen remained dark. No missed calls. No messages. Nothing. Earlier that night, there had been a man standing where she now stared. His voice replayed in her mind, sharp and hurried, stripped of warmth. He hadn't looked at the medical forms. He hadn't asked how the baby was doing. He kept glancing at his watch, his phone already in his hand. "I have something important to take care of," he had said, his tone more annoyed than concerned. "I'll be back soon." He spoke as if this moment, this hospital room, this pregnancy, this woman, were an inconvenience interrupting his real life. She had nodded slowly, too tired to argue, trusting the promise simply because she wanted to believe it. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Then two. Nurses changed shifts. The sky outside the small corridor window softened from black to deep blue, then to the faint gray of approaching morning. Dawn crept in quietly, revealing what the darkness had hidden, that the bench was cold, that her hands were trembling slightly, that she was truly alone. The man did not return. No explanation followed. No apology. Just absence. As the first rays of sunlight touched the hospital floor, something inside her shifted. Not anger, not panic, just understanding. A quiet, irreversible realization that the person she needed most had chosen not to be there. She lowered her gaze to her belly, pressing her palm gently against it, drawing strength from the steady reminder beneath her hand. In that silent corridor, as the world began another day, a decision was forming, one that would change everything. Because what he didn't know was that the woman he left behind had been carrying more than a child. She had always been the kind of woman people overlooked, not because she lacked presence, but because she never demanded attention. Calm in her movements, measured in her words, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that didn't need validation. She was educated, well-read, and deeply observant, the type who listened more than she spoke and understood far more than she revealed. In rooms where voices competed to be heard, she stayed composed, letting others take center stage. Not because she couldn't shine, but because she never needed to. When she married him, it wasn't for money, reputation, or ambition. She married for love, simple, sincere, and hopeful. At the time, he was driven, full of dreams and plans for the future. He talked endlessly about success, about building something meaningful, about becoming someone people would respect. She believed in him, not blindly, but thoughtfully. She saw potential where others saw risk, and she chose to stand beside him, not above him. From the very beginning of their marriage, she supported him quietly. When he doubted himself, she steadied him with calm encouragement. When he struggled to make decisions, she helped him think through options without ever taking credit. When opportunities came his way, many of them had been carefully positioned long before he noticed them. She never corrected him when he spoke proudly of being self-made. She never reminded him of the unseen doors that had opened just in time. To her, partnership wasn't about recognition. It was about stability. What he didn't know, and never bothered to ask, was that her life before him had been carefully structured around privacy. Her family legacy was managed discreetly, passed down through systems designed to protect rather than display. Wealth, in her world, was something to steward, not announce. Assets were held under quiet holding companies. Investments moved through layers of management that kept her name far from headlines. There were no luxury cars announcing success, no extravagant parties, no public gestures of power. Everything was intentional. Everything was quiet. She wanted a normal marriage, a life where love wasn't distorted by fear, control, or imbalance. She had seen what money did to relationships, how it shifted dynamics, created dependency, or bred resentment. She didn't want to be admired for what she had or obeyed because of what she controlled. She wanted to be chosen every day, simply for who she was. So she stayed in the background. She dressed simply. She downplayed her influence. She let him lead publicly while she supported privately. And when he spoke about struggle, about pressure, about being the one carrying the weight of everything, she never contradicted him. Silence, to her, was not surrender. It was choice. But over time, that silence began to be misunderstood. Her patience was mistaken for passivity. Her restraint was seen as limitation. Her calm was interpreted as dependence. Slowly, subtly, the way he looked at her changed. Where there had once been appreciation, there was now assumption. Where there had been partnership, there was now judgment. In this story, silence will be mistaken for weakness, and patience will be mistaken for poverty. At the beginning of their marriage, the imbalance was so subtle that even she barely noticed it. It didn't arrive as cruelty or open disrespect. It crept in quietly, disguised as confidence on his side and patience on hers. He was ambitious, outspoken, always eager to be seen as the one moving things forward. She, on the other hand, believed in steadiness. She believed that real strength didn't need to announce itself. At first, these differences seemed complementary. Over time, they became a divide. As his career progressed, his sense of self began to grow louder. Success to him was something to be displayed, measured, and talked about. He spoke in numbers, titles, and timelines. Every small win was a story to be retold. Every setback a battle he claimed to have fought alone. At dinners, at gatherings, even in casual conversations, he framed himself as the engine of their life together. "I'm building everything from scratch," he would say. "No one handed me anything." He said it often enough that he began to believe it completely. She rarely interrupted. She listened, not because she agreed with everything he said, but because she understood that his pride was fragile. While he spoke loudly about his struggles, she quietly carried solutions. When a bill was due and his cash flow was tight, it was mysteriously paid on time. When an opportunity appeared just when he needed it most, she never explained how it came to be. When a risky decision worked out in his favor, she simply smiled and congratulated him. To her, partnership meant protecting his confidence, even if it meant shrinking her own presence. But as his belief in being self-made hardened, so did his dismissal of her role. He began to see her calm as complacency. Her quiet support became invisible. He started measuring contribution only in ways that looked impressive to outsiders. Big gestures, public wins, visible effort. And because her contributions didn't fit that image, he slowly concluded that they didn't exist at all. The comments started small, almost careless. "You're lucky you don't have to worry about money like I do," he once said, half joking. Another time, when she suggested a more cautious approach to a decision, he laughed it off. "You wouldn't understand this kind of pressure," he replied. Each remark landed softly, but they accumulated, forming a pattern she couldn't ignore. He no longer spoke to her as an equal partner. He spoke as if he were the one carrying weight, and she was simply along for the ride. In public, the imbalance became clearer. When they were with friends, he dominated the conversation. He told stories of long nights, tough negotiations, and sacrifices he claimed no one else could make. He spoke about their lifestyle as something he alone had earned. She sat beside him, composed, nodding politely, never correcting him. When someone asked what she did, he answered before she could. "She keeps things running at home," he would say, dismissively, as if that explained everything. What those friends never saw were the quiet transfers made behind the scenes, the accounts she managed indirectly, the advisors she consulted without ever attaching her name, the safety nets she built so carefully that he never felt them. When rent increased unexpectedly, the increase was absorbed without discussion. When his business needed an emergency injection of funds, it arrived through channels he assumed were unrelated strokes of luck. She paid bills without sitting him down for gratitude. She solved problems without demanding recognition. And because she never claimed credit, he assumed there was none to give. Over time, his frustration with her grew, not because she did too little, but because she did not mirror his energy. Her calm unsettled him. When he came home angry, loud, and stressed, she responded with measured words instead of panic. When he sought validation, she offered perspective instead of applause. To him, her steadiness began to feel like indifference. He mistook her emotional control for a lack of passion, her restraint for a lack of ambition. "You should do more," he said one evening, irritation clear in his voice. "I feel like everything is on my shoulders." She looked at him then, really looked at him, searching for a trace of the man she had married. Instead of arguing, she asked gently, "What does more look like to you?" He didn't have an answer. He just knew that whatever she was doing didn't feel impressive enough anymore. That was the quiet cruelty of it. He didn't see her sacrifices because they didn't look dramatic. He didn't value her contributions because they didn't inflate his image. And slowly, he began to resent her, not for holding him back, but for reminding him, without words, that real strength didn't need noise. In his mind, the story became simple. He was the builder, the provider, the one who mattered. She was supportive, yes, but replaceable. And the more he believed that story, the easier it became to dismiss her presence, her voice, and eventually, her worth. The pregnancy didn't arrive with fanfare or celebration. It came quietly, almost gently, like everything else in her life. When she told him, she did so with a soft smile and careful words, watching his face for reassurance. At first, he reacted the way she expected, surprised, then pleased, then quickly distracted by practical concerns. He talked about timing, expenses, and responsibility. She told herself that this was normal, that people processed life-changing news differently. Still, something shifted in that moment, subtle but unmistakable. As her body began to change, so did her needs. The calm strength she had always relied on now had limits. Morning sickness lingered longer than expected. Fatigue weighed heavier, seeping into her bones. Some days, standing felt like effort. Doctors' visits became more frequent, their expressions more serious. They spoke carefully, choosing words that signaled concern without causing panic. Complications were possible, they said. Extra rest was necessary. Stress needed to be minimized. She nodded, absorbing everything, but what she needed most wasn't medical advice. It was reassurance, presence, a partner who would sit beside her and remind her that she wasn't facing this alone. Instead, he began to pull away. At first, it was small things. He missed appointments, apologizing afterward with vague excuses. He stopped asking how she felt, assuming silence meant stability. When she mentioned discomfort or fear, he brushed it aside, telling her not to worry so much. "You're strong," he said, as if strength made vulnerability unnecessary. She tried to believe him, even as nights grew longer and lonelier. As weeks passed, his distance became routine. He stayed out later than before, often returning home distracted and tense. When she asked where he'd been, he blamed work, stress, pressure, deadlines. He spoke as if the weight of the world rested entirely on his shoulders. She didn't argue. She had always understood pressure. She had built her life around managing it quietly. But now, carrying a child and managing uncertainty, she needed him in ways she hadn't before. And he was no longer there. The emotional gap widened. Conversations became shorter, colder. When she tried to share her fears about the baby, about her health, he responded with irritation. "Do you know how much I'm dealing with right now?" he snapped one evening. The words stung, not because they were loud, but because they dismissed her reality entirely. From that moment on, she learned to choose her words carefully, to weigh whether speaking was worth the tension it caused. It was around this time that she noticed the phone. He had always used it openly before, leaving it on tables, answering calls without concern. Now, it never left his hand. Notifications were silenced. Calls were taken in other rooms, voices lowered, doors half closed. When she entered unexpectedly, conversations ended abruptly. "Work," he would say quickly, eyes avoiding hers. She didn't push. She didn't accuse. She had learned long ago that truth often revealed itself without confrontation. Along with secrecy came a sharpness she hadn't known him for. Small disagreements escalated quickly. Patience vanished. Her questions were met with defensiveness. Her silence, once tolerated, now irritated him. It was as if her presence reminded him of something he didn't want to face. Slowly, painfully, she began to feel like an obstacle in her own home. There was no dramatic betrayal she could point to. No clear moment where everything broke. Just a steady accumulation of absence, missed dinners, unreturned messages. A growing sense that her pregnancy, once a shared future, had become an inconvenience. She overheard him one night on the phone, his voice strained. "I can't deal with this right now," he said. He didn't say her name, but he didn't need to. The meaning settled heavily in her chest. Her vulnerability deepened. Some nights, fear crept in quietly. Fear of complications, fear of raising a child alone, fear that the life she had carefully built was slipping away. She lay awake listening for his return, counting minutes, then hours. When he finally came home, he went straight to bed, turning his back to her. She stared at the ceiling, one hand resting on her belly, whispering promises to the child she hadn't yet met. What hurt most wasn't the distance itself, but the realization behind it. She was no longer his partner in his eyes. She was a reminder of responsibility when he wanted freedom, of commitment when he wanted escape. The pregnancy, instead of bringing them closer, had exposed the imbalance that had always existed. And somewhere between the hidden phone calls, the late nights, and the growing hostility, she understood something with chilling clarity. To him, she was now in the way. The night she was admitted to the hospital did not begin with panic. It began with discomfort she tried to manage quietly, the way she had managed everything else. A tightening in her abdomen that wouldn't ease. A dizziness that made the room tilt when she stood. She told herself it would pass, that she just needed rest. But when the pain sharpened and her breath came shorter, instinct overruled patience. She called for help. The emergency room was bright and efficient, filled with controlled urgency. Nurses moved quickly but calmly, their voices steady, their hands sure. Questions were asked. Monitors were attached. Curtains were drawn. A doctor explained that it could be nothing serious, but it also could be something they needed to watch closely. "We're going to admit you for observation," he said gently, "just to be safe." His tone was reassuring, but his eyes were careful. As she lay on the narrow hospital bed, the reality of the situation settled in. This was no longer something she could carry alone. She reached for her phone and called him. No answer. She waited a minute and tried again. Still nothing. On the third call, it rang longer before going to voicemail. She ended the call without leaving a message, staring at the ceiling instead. The lights above her were too bright, the room too quiet. Around her, machines beeped softly, marking time she couldn't control. She sent a brief text, just the facts, no emotion. "I'm at the hospital. They admitted me. Please come." Time stretched. Nurses checked on her. Another doctor reviewed her chart. They spoke in calm, professional tones, careful not to alarm her. She nodded, answering questions, following instructions. Outwardly, she remained composed. Inside, anxiety curled tightly in her chest. Not just fear for herself or the baby, but fear of being alone in a moment she had never imagined facing without him. When he finally arrived, it wasn't relief she felt. It was confusion. He stood at the foot of the bed, phone still in his hand, jacket half on, as if he hadn't fully committed to being there. His expression wasn't concern, it was irritation. "Why didn't you tell me it was this late?" he asked, glancing at his watch. "I had things going on." His words landed heavily in the sterile room. She searched his face for worry, for tenderness, for anything familiar. She found none. She tried to explain, quietly, that the pain had come on suddenly, that the doctors wanted to keep her overnight. He sighed loudly, rubbing his forehead. "This is terrible timing," he muttered. "Do you know how much pressure I'm under right now?" He didn't ask what the doctors had said. He didn't ask how she felt. He paced once, then twice, already restless. A notification buzzed on his phone. He looked at it, then at her. "I need to take this," he said, already turning toward the door. She watched him leave the room, the curtain rustling behind him. Through the thin walls, she could hear his voice drop, the tension sharpening. She couldn't make out the words, but she heard enough to know the tone impatient, urgent, detached. When he returned, something had hardened in him. He didn't sit. He didn't come closer. He stood near the door, arms crossed, eyes distant. The air between them felt heavier, colder. She sensed what was coming before he spoke, a quiet dread settling deep in her stomach. "I can't do this anymore," he said suddenly, as if finishing a thought he'd been having for weeks. His voice wasn't angry. It was flat, resolved. She looked at him, stunned. "Do what?" she asked, though she already knew. "This," he replied, gesturing vaguely to the room, the bed, her pregnancy. All of it. The stress, the responsibility. "I'm drowning." He paused, then added, almost casually, "Maybe it's better if we end this now." A divorce would make things simpler. The word hung in the air, unreal. Divorce. Spoken in a hospital room, beside a woman carrying his child, as if it were a scheduling inconvenience. She waited for him to soften it, to explain, to say something that made sense of the cruelty. He didn't. He checked his phone again, avoiding her eyes. "I can't stay," he said. "I need space." She didn't scream. She didn't plead. She didn't remind him of vows or futures or promises whispered in quieter rooms. Something inside her went very still. In that moment, all the arguing she might have done felt useless. She saw, with sudden clarity, that his decision had already been made long before this night. He took a step toward the door. She expected him to hesitate, to look back, to say something, anything that acknowledged the gravity of what he was doing. He didn't. He pulled the curtain aside and walked out, his footsteps fading quickly down the corridor. The sound of them disappeared, swallowed by the hum of the hospital. She lay there alone, the room unchanged but everything else irrevocably different. A nurse came in quietly to adjust a monitor, offering a gentle smile. "Try to rest," she said softly. The woman nodded, though sleep felt impossible. Silence settled around her, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that follows a truth too heavy to ignore. She placed her hand over her belly, feeling the faint movement beneath her palm. In that stillness, there were no tears, No dramatic collapse. Just realization. He was gone. And in that moment, as the machines continued their steady rhythm, she understood that the life she had been protecting so carefully had just begun without him. The hospital room felt different once the door closed behind him. Not emptier, just clearer. The air settled, the noise of his presence replaced by a steady quiet that allowed her thoughts to finally line up. Machines continued their soft, rhythmic beeping. Outside, footsteps passed, voices murmured, life carried on. Inside the room, she lay still, one hand resting on her belly, breathing slowly, deliberately. For the first time that night, she wasn't waiting for him to come back. She reached for her phone. Not to call him. She scrolled past his name without hesitation and stopped at a number she hadn't dialed in years. The lawyer. A man who had once insisted she memorize his direct line just in case. At the time, she had smiled and told him she hoped she'd never need it. Now, she pressed call. He answered on the second ring, his voice alert despite the hour. She didn't explain everything. She didn't need to. She spoke calmly, clearly, outlining only what mattered. Hospital admission, abandonment, divorce mentioned. Silence followed on the other end, not confusion, but understanding. I'll handle it, he said simply. Focus on your health. I'll be in touch. The call ended. No drama, no tears. She stared at the ceiling for a moment, feeling something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not anger, not fear. Resolve. Her next call was to the family office manager. The number was saved under a neutral name, another layer of intentional anonymity. He answered immediately, respectful as always. She told him she needed things reviewed, quietly. No sudden moves. No announcements. I want everything positioned, she said. Not executed, just ready. He understood the difference. He always had. Consider it done, he replied. The third call took longer to connect. A board representative. Someone who knew her not as a wife, not as a patient, but as a principal. She didn't give details. She didn't ask for sympathy. She asked for timing, for discretion, for patience. The response was measured and professional. We'll wait for your signal, he said. But things can start shifting in the background. She ended the call and set the phone down. Nothing had changed outwardly. No dramatic entrances. No urgent meetings. No confrontations. But beneath the surface, movement had begun quiet, precise, irreversible. She closed her eyes, feeling the tension in her body ease just slightly. For the first time in weeks, she felt supported, not emotionally, but structurally. Systems were aligning. Safeguards were being activated. The world she had built in silence was waking up. Across the city, he was doing the opposite. He posted a photo later that morning smiling, relaxed, drink in hand. The caption was light, almost celebratory. Something about new beginnings. Friends reacted quickly. Comments poured in. Congratulations. Jokes. Praise. Someone wrote, "Looks like freedom suits you." He liked the comment. He told people the story the way he wanted it told. That the marriage had been holding him back. That the pressure had been unbearable. That he was finally choosing himself. He didn't mention the hospital. He didn't mention the pregnancy. He told his version loudly, confidently, believing volume could turn narrative into truth. With renewed confidence, he began making decisions he had been waiting to make. Plans he felt had been delayed by compromise. He authorized expenses without consultation. He committed to deals he barely skimmed. He moved money the way someone does when they believe nothing is watching. He spoke boldly in meetings, assured of his authority, convinced that momentum was on his side. What he didn't notice were the small changes. An email that went unanswered longer than usual. A confirmation that arrived with unfamiliar wording. A meeting rescheduled without explanation. At first, he brushed it off as coincidence. Systems were slow sometimes. People were busy. He was used to obstacles smoothing themselves out eventually. They always had. But elsewhere, documents were being reviewed, signatures quietly delayed, clauses re-examined, timelines adjusted by days, then weeks. Advisors spoke carefully, using language that sounded supportive while quietly preparing for alternatives. Nothing collapsed. Nothing exploded. It was more unsettling than that. Things simply shifted. Back in the hospital, she watched the morning light move across the wall. Doctors came and went, offering updates that were cautiously optimistic. She listened, asked questions, followed instructions. When she was alone again, she allowed herself a long breath. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't plotting revenge. She was stabilizing her health, her child's future, her life. Occasionally, she checked her phone. Not his messages. There were none but quiet confirmations from people who understood restraint. Reviewed. In progress. Standing by. Each message was brief, professional, and reassuring. No one asked how she felt. No one offered sympathy. They offered competence. As the day wore on, the contrast between their worlds sharpened. He moved loudly, convinced of his independence. She remained still, letting systems do what they were designed to do. He believed freedom meant cutting ties. She knew freedom meant having options. By evening, the hospital room felt less like a place of abandonment and more like a place of transition. She adjusted her pillow, one hand returning to her belly, grounding herself in the quiet certainty growing inside her. Whatever came next would not be rushed. It would not be announced. It would unfold at its own pace. Because while he celebrated his freedom in public, smiling for cameras and strangers alike, contracts were being reviewed in private rooms. Decisions were being reconsidered. Power was being redistributed, not with anger, not with noise, but with precision. And he had no idea. While he celebrated freedom, everything he relied on was quietly moving away. The first sign that something was wrong came quietly, almost politely. He was standing in line for coffee when his card declined. He laughed it off, assuming it was a network issue, and tried again. Declined. Mild irritation flickered across his face as he pulled out another card. Same result. People behind him shifted impatiently. Embarrassed, he paid cash and walked away, telling himself he'd deal with it later. These things happened sometimes. Systems glitched. Banks made mistakes. By the time he reached his office, the irritation had grown into unease. His phone buzzed with notifications, emails marked urgent, messages from his finance team asking if he had authorized changes. He skimmed them quickly, missing the careful wording, the absence of reassurance. When he tried to log into one of the company accounts, access was denied. He refreshed the page. Tried again. Nothing. A call to the bank led to a scripted response delivered in a calm, professional tone. Certain activities on the account are under review, the representative said. Temporary restrictions have been placed. By who? He demanded. I'm afraid I can't disclose that information, she replied. Annoyed but not yet alarmed, he hung up and moved on to what he considered more important. That afternoon, he was scheduled to finalize a deal he'd been boasting about for weeks. A major partnership. The kind that solidified his image as a rising force. He arrived confident, prepared to sign, already rehearsing the announcement he'd make afterward. But the meeting didn't go as planned. The other party was apologetic, but firm. Terms had changed. Funding was no longer guaranteed. Risk assessments had been re-evaluated. We can't move forward, they said, sliding the papers back across the table. He argued, pressed, reminded them of verbal commitments. They listened politely, then repeated the same sentence. The deal was off. By the end of the day, confidence had turned into confusion. The call for the meeting came the next morning. No explanation, no agenda. Just a short message requesting his presence at a boardroom he rarely used. He assumed it was damage control and opportunity to reassert authority. He straightened his jacket, rehearsed explanations, and walked in expecting familiar faces. He didn't find them. The room was filled with people he didn't recognize. Men and women seated calmly around the long table, folders neatly arranged, expressions unreadable. Some nodded politely as he entered. Others barely looked up. At the head of the table, a large screen glowed softly, displaying a series of charts and figures already in motion. He took a seat, suddenly aware that no one had stood to greet him. The presentation began without introduction. Numbers shifted across the screen: investment flows, ownership structures, capital injections stretching back years. The language was formal, precise, and entirely unfamiliar. He leaned forward, trying to follow along, but the documents placed in front of him only deepened the confusion. Legal terms he didn't recognize. Agreements he didn't remember signing. References to entities he'd never heard of. Then he noticed the name. It appeared once at first, buried in a footnote. Then again on another slide, and another. Always the same. Not highlighted, not emphasized. Just present. A quiet constant threading through every major financial pillar he depended on. He interrupted, frustration breaking through. Why is this name on everything? He demanded. A pause followed. One of the board members, someone he had never met, finally looked directly at him. Because it's the source, he said evenly. The room went silent as understanding began to form, slow and unwelcome. They explained it methodically, without accusation or drama. The company he believed he was building his future on had never stood alone. The funding that arrived just in time during difficult phases. The contracts that survived scrutiny when they shouldn't have. The growth he bragged about as proof of his own brilliance. All of it traced back to a single, consistent investor, one who never attended meetings, never appeared in photos, never sought recognition. A silent investor. Someone who preferred distance over dominance. Structure over spectacle. Someone whose involvement had been carefully shielded, not hidden illegally, but intentionally, through holding companies, trusts, and advisory layers designed for discretion. When the final slide appeared, there was no dramatic reveal. Just a simple organizational chart, clean, minimal. And there, at the top, was her name. His wife. The room didn't react. No gasps, no whispers. Just quiet acknowledgement. This wasn't shocking to them. It was procedural. To them, this was a matter of alignment, not betrayal. Authority had always been defined. He had simply misunderstood where it came from. His mouth opened, then closed again. Images flooded his mind. The hospital bed, the documents in her hand, the way she had looked at him without begging, without shouting. The memory landed with new weight. This wasn't retaliation. This wasn't revenge. This was consequence. The board member continued calmly. Given the recent changes in your personal circumstances, he said, choosing his words carefully, certain safeguards were activated. Nothing was done impulsively. Everything followed protocol. He barely heard the rest. His world had narrowed to a single truth. The foundation he stood on had never been his alone. And the moment he walked away from her, it shifted. As the meeting adjourned, people gathered their papers and left without comment. No one lingered to explain further. There was nothing left to explain. He remained seated long after the room emptied, staring at the screen now gone dark. For the first time since he'd walked out of that hospital, he understood what silence really meant. It wasn't weakness. It was ownership, and it had always belonged to her. He didn't go to the hospital right away. At first, he sat alone in his car outside the office building, hands resting uselessly on the steering wheel, staring through the windshield without seeing anything. The boardroom replayed in fragments faces he didn't recognize, documents he couldn't explain, her name appearing again and again like a truth he had deliberately refused to learn. The confidence that had once filled his chest was gone, replaced by something heavier and unfamiliar. Not fear exactly. regret had a different weight. When he finally asked where she was, the answer came simply, without drama. The hospital, the same place he had walked out of. The drive there felt longer than it should have. Every traffic light seemed to stretch, every turn dragging out the inevitable. With each mile, memories surfaced her quiet presence, the way she listened without interrupting, the calm he had once mistaken for dependence. He remembered how easily he had turned away that night, how quickly he had chosen escape over responsibility. At the time, it had felt like relief. Now, it felt like cowardice. The hospital looked different in daylight, brighter, more orderly. When he stepped inside, the familiar smell of disinfectant hit him, pulling him back to that night. For a brief moment, he expected to see her sitting alone again, documents in hand, waiting. Instead, he was stopped before he could take another step. A man in a tailored suit approached him calmly. "She's expecting you," he said, not asking, not inviting, informing. He followed down the corridor, his footsteps slower now, heavier. As they neared her room, he noticed details he hadn't before. Staff moved with purpose. Nurses spoke quietly but attentively. A doctor stepped out of the room, reviewing notes, and nodded respectfully toward the suited man beside him. Everything felt organized, intentional. When he reached the doorway, he hesitated. Inside, she sat upright in the bed, her posture composed despite the monitors and 4 lines. She looked tired, yes, but not broken. Beside her stood 2 lawyers, their presence unobtrusive but unmistakable. A doctor reviewed her chart nearby, speaking softly, with care and attention. This was not the scene of abandonment he had left behind. This was something else entirely. She looked up and met his eyes. There was no shock on her face. No anger, just recognition. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, but different from before. This silence wasn't absence. It was finality. "You're here," she said calmly. He nodded, unsure what to say. Apologies crowded his mind, but none seemed sufficient. Explanations rose, but he knew how hollow they would sound. He took a step closer, then stopped, suddenly aware that he no longer knew his place in the room. "I didn't know," he finally said, his voice low, "about any of it." She studied him for a long moment, not with triumph, not with resentment, with clarity, as if she were seeing him exactly as he was, stripped of the illusions he had wrapped himself in for years. "I never needed you to know who I was," she said quietly. "I only needed you to stay." The words landed softly, but their weight was devastating. He swallowed hard. In that sentence, he heard everything he had ignored. The night she had listened while he talked about pressure. The time she had steadied him without recognition. The hospital corridor where she had waited alone. She hadn't wanted power over him. She had wanted partnership, presence, loyalty. Around them, no one moved. The lawyers remained respectfully silent. The doctor finished his notes and stepped back. Decisions had already been made: medical, legal, personal. She was protected now, not because she had demanded it, but because she had finally allowed the structures she built to do what they were meant to do. "I can fix this," he said desperately, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "I can stay now. I can." She shook her head gently, not in anger, in certainty. "This isn't about fixing," she replied. "It's about timing. And you chose yours." Her hand rested on her belly, instinctive, grounding. The child shifted beneath her palm, a quiet reminder of the future unfolding without him at its center. He watched the movement, understanding with painful clarity what he had lost. Not money, not status, but the chance to be present when it mattered most. "I never asked you to be impressed by me," she continued. "I never asked you to depend on me. I only asked you not to leave." The room felt smaller then, as if the truth had drawn the walls closer. He realized that everything he had chased, freedom, validation, admiration, had cost him the one thing he couldn't rebuild. "I'm sorry," he he whispered, though the apology felt inadequate even as he said it. She nodded once, acknowledging the words without accepting or rejecting them. I know, she said, but sorry doesn't change what happened. There was no argument, no raised voices, just a quiet understanding settling into place. When he finally turned to leave, she didn't stop him. She didn't watch him go. Her attention returned to the doctor, to the future being discussed calmly beside her. The lawyers made notes. Plans moved forward. He paused at the doorway, looking back one last time. She was already elsewhere, mentally, emotionally, structurally, beyond the reach of regret. As he walked down the corridor, the realization followed him like a shadow. He had walked away from her when she needed him most, believing he was choosing freedom. Only now did he understand the truth. He hadn't left weakness behind in that hospital. He had left strength. Time moved forward, quietly at first, then all at once. The birth came on a calm morning, nothing like the chaos she had once feared. The hospital room was filled with soft light and steady voices. Doctors moved with confidence. Nurses spoke gently, explaining each step before it happened. She breathed through the pain with focus and determination, her hand gripping the side of the bed, her other resting instinctively on her belly. There was no shouting, no panic, no absence. When the baby finally cried, strong, clear, alive tears filled her eyes, not from fear or loneliness, but from relief. She had done it, peacefully, on her own terms. In that moment, as she held her child against her chest, everything else fell into its proper place. The noise of the past faded. The betrayal, the abandonment, the confusion, all of it shrank in the presence of something far more powerful. This was not the future she had imagined years ago, but it was the one she now claimed fully. After leaving the hospital, her life unfolded with intention. There were no dramatic announcements, no public statements, no need to prove anything to anyone. She moved into a space that felt safe and grounded, designed not for appearances, but for comfort. Her days were structured around balance work that mattered, rest that healed, and a child who became the center of her world. Stability replaced uncertainty. Calm replaced chaos. She built a future the same way she had built everything else, quietly and deliberately. Her child grew surrounded by consistency. There were routines, laughter, and warmth, no raised voices, no emotional unpredictability. The home became a place of security, not tension. She raised her child with honesty and presence, teaching them through example that strength didn't need to dominate to exist. Love was shown not in grand gestures, but in reliability, in staying, and she stayed. Meanwhile, his life moved in a very different direction. There was no dramatic downfall, no public humiliation, just the slow, steady weight of regret settling in. Deals no longer came easily. Conversations felt hollow. The applause he once chased sounded thinner, less convincing. At night, when the distractions faded, memories crept in uninvited. The hospital corridor, her calm eyes, the way she hadn't begged him to stay. He realized too late that power had never been loud. The people who truly controlled outcomes didn't shout. They didn't boast. They didn't demand attention. They built quietly, patiently, and protected what mattered long before anyone else noticed. The woman he had dismissed had embodied that truth all along. He just hadn't known how to recognize it. There was no revenge waiting for him, no confrontation, no dramatic reckoning beyond the one he carried within himself. He wasn't haunted by anger. He was haunted by absence, by the knowledge that the door he walked through so confidently had closed behind him without noise, without ceremony, and without reopening. He understood, slowly and painfully, that love abandoned doesn't disappear. It transforms. It becomes strength redirected, focus reclaimed, energy invested elsewhere. What he mistook for weakness had been restraint. What he saw as dependence had been choice. And what he thought would always be, there had been a gift that required presence, not entitlement. For her, There was no need to look back. Her life wasn't defined by what she lost, but by what she protected. She didn't harden. She didn't grow bitter. She simply grew clearer. Clear about boundaries. Clear about worth. Clear about the kind of love she would allow near her child. And that clarity became her quiet victory. For the audience, the lesson lingers long after the story ends. Some people leave when they think you have nothing. Some betray you because they mistake silence for weakness. And some lessons only arrive after doors are permanently closed. Not every loss comes with noise. Not every ending comes with warning. And not every strong person announces themselves before they rise. Sometimes the most powerful thing someone can do is stay when it's uncomfortable, when it's inconvenient, when it doesn't benefit them immediately. Because presence, more than promises, reveals character. So the question remains long after the screen fades to black. How many people do we abandon? Simply because we don't know their worth yet?